this moment in the debate typifies the problem I'm highlighting. When Peterson is asked, did Cain and Abel really exist? His response is to denigrate the question as, quote, silly.
And I know that you want to say that the story which
I think it's a silly question.
Responding to a basic existential question by alleging that the question itself is silly should raise a red flag in anyone's mind. Thank you to my patrons and YouTube channel members. Please consider joining our community today. Simply click the link in the description or tap the join button below. Thank you. The fundamental problem with Jordan Peterson, or at least one fundamental problem with Jordan Peterson, is that he tries to avoid directly answering certain existential questions, especially in the domain of religion. He ambiguates as opposed to disambiguating. He complicates as opposed to simplifying. He appears to prefer blurring the line between fiction and non-fiction as opposed to straightforwardly answering when questioned on the existence of something contained in the biblical narrative. In other words, rather than admit that a myth is just that, a myth, Peterson blurs the line between mere narrative on one hand and what manifests in reality on the other. Using this rhetorical style, Peterson can pander to his sizable religious audience, due in part to avoiding any unambiguous existential declarations of falsehood pertaining to the supernatural, choosing instead to dignify these religious ideas with statements about not only how real and profound they allegedly are, but about how hyper-real they allegedly are.
Hyper-real.
Consider the following from Peterson's Daily Wire debate with one Richard Dawkins, moderated by Alex O'Connor.
Do you believe Cain existed?
I think the pattern that Cain represents is an eternal pattern. And so
yes,
it's a higher
different.
level of existence.
That's different. I realize that.
Well, there are Cain types who exist, and they're
there are Cain types.
Yeah.
But Cain himself, I mean, you give the game away where you say in your book, Cain and Abel were the first humans to be born in the natural way. Now that betrays you as it were pretending you think they really existed, because you wouldn't have said they were born in a natural way unless you were muddling up facts with symbols there.
You must know, I know this comes up all of the time when somebody says, but did Cain and Abel really exist? And I know that you want to say that the story which
I think it's a silly question. I think it's like asking whether Raskolnikov existed in Crime and Punishment. Like it's not a trivial question, because you can answer yes and you can answer no. You can say, well, there was no such specific person as Raskolnikov. But it's not a helpful question, because the reason that Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is a masterpiece is because Raskolnikov was everywhere in Russia when Dostoevsky wrote Crime and Punishment. And so Raskolnikov is hyper-real, not real.
As you can see, this moment in the debate typifies the problem I'm highlighting. When Peterson is asked, did Cain and Abel really exist? His response is to denigrate the question as, quote, silly.
And I know that you want to say that the story which
I think it's a silly question.
Responding to a basic existential question by alleging that the question itself is silly should raise a red flag in anyone's mind. But he doesn't stop there. Peterson alleges that such questions are akin to asking whether or not the character of Raskolnikov from the novel Crime and Punishment really existed.
I think it's like asking whether Raskolnikov existed in Crime and Punishment.
But is this a fair comparison? Or does it serve to distract, ambiguate, and obstruct? I submit to you that what ensues arguably achieves all three. I mean, every second the three spend discussing Peterson's bogus comparison is another second that Peterson escapes answering the initial question as to whether or not Cain and Abel existed. But for the sake of being thorough, I repeat, is the comparison between Raskolnikov and Cain and Abel a fair one? Need I state the obvious? Crime and Punishment is fiction and is intended as such. Crime and Punishment isn't a news journal. It's not a diary entry. It's not a science text, historical account, or documentary. It's a story. The characters are the creations of one Dostoevsky, and any similarities to persons in the real world are coincidental. With this in mind, to ask whether or not Raskolnikov exists would be to disqualify oneself from rational conversation. It would be like asking, does Tony Montana exist? Or does Walter White exist? Clearly, these characters are fictional.
You're goddamn right.
And any individual who may suggest otherwise would and should pay a social price in ill-concealed laughter. So yes, Dr. Peterson, it would be silly to ask whether or not Raskolnikov truly existed. But the same cannot be said for the Bible. Many of the characters are alleged to be real historical persons who, for example, encountered the risen Jesus, or served him, or witnessed his miracles, etc. Not to mention the character of Christ himself. Christians disagree, of course, on what exactly counts as literal versus that which counts as metaphorical. For example, according to my understanding, the idea that Adam and Eve literally existed is not widely held, although there's a minority of Christians who still subscribe to the idea that the book of Genesis should be interpreted literally. On the other hand, the ministry of Jesus and his death and resurrection are commonly believed to be actual historical events, as relayed by the Gospels. St. Paul himself said, quote, "If Christ is not risen, our faith is futile." Given this, is it not entirely reasonable to ask, did Cain and Abel really exist?
I think it's a silly question.
We're talking here about a religion with billions of followers and thousands of denominations. Surely a question about the literal existence of Cain and Abel is an intelligible one, an answer to which would, 1, help the questioner understand what kind of Christian they're dealing with, and 2, help the questioner to develop their knowledge about the intersection between literal and metaphorical writing styles in the Bible. The question, did Cain and Abel really exist, is presumably essential for anyone who's wondering about the category into which the story of Cain and Abel fits, be it history, parables, prophecy, etc. But no, rather than consider any of this, Peterson chooses instead to attack the question, labeling it as silly. It should be obvious by now that such a response does absolutely nothing to foster an intellectually healthy dialectic. Rather, it smothers it. Suffice to say, in defense of his preposterous assertions, Peterson erects a ludicrous comparison between Cain and Abel on one hand and Raskolnikov from the novel Crime and Punishment on the other, itself an unambiguously fictional narrative. It's like Peterson is oblivious to the fact that 2 billion people on this planet have varying degrees of commitment to the propositional truth claims of Christianity, not to mention the subset thereof who order their entire lives around said propositions, all on the strength of their belief in the literal truth of Christian doctrine. It is these facts that shine the brightest light on Peterson's absurd comparison with Raskolnikov. As far as I'm aware, nobody is dedicating their life to a set of ideas built upon a foundational belief in the literal existence of Raskolnikov. Nobody is basing their vote in the next presidential election on their belief, or lack thereof, in Raskolnikov. Nobody is discriminating against women and members of the LGBTQ+ community based on Raskolnikovism. Children aren't being indoctrinated with anti-scientific nonsense in schools based on deeply held beliefs about the literal existence of Raskolnikov, etc. Suffice to say, Cain and Abel exist among a patchwork of characters, some literal, some metaphorical, in a religion whose adherents disagree about that which should be taken literally and that which should be interpreted symbolically, metaphorically, archetypically, psychologically, etc. With this in mind, asking, did Cain and Abel really exist, is completely reasonable, because unlike Raskolnikov, there are many theists who believe that Cain and Abel did in fact really exist. Henceforth, Richard Dawkins and Alex O'Connor want to know if Peterson fits into the category of those who believe that Cain and Abel literally existed. Yet, Peterson dismisses this question as silly and erects a profoundly stupid comparison.
I think it's a silly question.
This, I submit to you, is not an intellectually serious position. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here. And if you enjoyed this clip, please consider checking out the full episode right here. Alternatively, and if you're in the mood for something else, why not check out this episode right here? Either way, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.